Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming to the SEFS Seminar today. I am really honored to introduce our speaker today. Jan van Wagtendonk is my father-in-law, and I am Liz van Wagtendonk. I am a PhD student in the SEFS program under the advisement of Dr. Van Kane and also Monica Mescal. And to give you a little bit of background on Jan really quick before we go ahead and launch into his talk. Jan van Wagtendonk was in the cohort at UC Berkeley back in the days. Raise your hand if anybody knows Jim Agee. All right. So Jan was in the cohort under Harold Biswell, sort of the godfather of fire ecology in California at UC Berkeley. And here's a shameless plug for his book. It's the second edition of Fire in California Ecosystems. So if you get a chance, a great reference on fire in California. And of course, it's been very active in the Yosemite area. And so I'm going to go ahead and have him come on up and start his talk. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you, Liz. So the talk today will be about fire ecology and fire management in the Yosemite National Park. So it's going to be very park-oriented and very California-oriented. I know I'm up here in a place where the sun never shines, but I want to show you some places where the sun do shine. You're going to have to come to this.
Uh-oh. You want to go back?
First, to give you an idea of the mission of the National Park Service, which is different than National Forests. We're not in the business of cutting trees down necessarily, certainly not for profit. The Park Service has a unique mission that's to preserve unimpaired natural and cultural resources and values of the National Park System for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. So it's a dual mandate. Not only is the Park Service required to preserve these natural resources and cultural resources, but also has to provide for the enjoyment of those resources by the public. And that conflict in the Organic Act of the National Park Service has been present since 1916 and continues today to be one of the problems that the Park Service has. In the term natural resources, though, I don't know whether in 1916 the writers of the Act had fire in mind. In fact, I'm sure they didn't. But in modern times, we've learned to recognize that fire is one of those natural resources, a natural component of ecosystems. And in order for that to be the case, you need fuel. You've got to have something to burn. That's one of the basic fire ecology lessons. If there's nothing there to burn, then fire ecology plays no part in that particular resource. We have lots of fuel in Yosemite and throughout the Sierra Nevada, and in fact throughout the western United States. It's a problem that continues today. But not only do you have to have fuel present, you need to have weather conditions conducive to burning. And that's one of the differences, I think, between California and the Pacific Northwest. There is a window in the Pacific Northwest when these fuels will burn. That window is not as large as the window in California. There's a greater, longer period of time when those fuels that have accumulated over the years can burn. And the result of that is a shorter fire return interval. So it burns more frequently because you have more opportunities for those fires to burn. But you're not going to get a fire unless you have some ignition source. So you can have the best weather possible for burning, and all the fuel's up to here, but if there's no source of ignition, then you're not going to have, fire's not going to play a role in that ecosystem. But we've had lots of lightning in Yosemite. Some of it even hits half dome at the top, and it's killed people up there. So on average, we get 1,450 lightning strikes each year in Yosemite, which might not sound like a lot unless you're up there on Half Dome, one of those days when they're hitting you. And these lightning strikes result in approximately 65 lightning fires per year. So that natural ignition source is sufficient to make fire a recurring process within the park. Those lightning ignitions have been over time supplemented by ignitions by humans. And Native Americans have been present in the Yosemite area for at least 9,000 years. And that's enough time for forests to evolve to some adaptation to those added ignitions that the Native Americans provided. They had a cultural purpose for burning. It wasn't just random burning. There was a specific reason for burning. And you can imagine, if you live in an area where the fuel's up to here, you don't want to just randomly place ignitions out there. You want to have some purpose, cultural purpose for burning. And most of their purposes were to produce acorns, edible fuels, or edible feed. Also to produce tools that they use for their farming, to produce basketry material. So there's many, many uses of the natural resource that Native Americans were able to husband, really, through the use of fire. Their effect varied over the space as well as over time. So it wasn't as if every area in the park or throughout the Sierra Nevada was influenced directly or influenced in the same manner, in the same frequency as those areas around their communities. So there was more frequent fires added to the fire regime around those areas, particularly in the areas that they used to produce the products from the natural resources that they need. We also have another ignition source. No, just kidding. This is the firefall that occurs in Yosemite today. And some of you might know that there used to be a spot in Yosemite where they kicked red fir bark over the edge of the cliff to produce a firefall, and all the people would gather on the valley floor, and this guy would sing this song like, "Hear the firefall," and they would have something that looked similar to this. This is natural. This is a waterfall that during February and a clear night, the sun setting actually lights up the fall. Doesn't light any fires, however. The park was established in 1864 in Yosemite Valley in the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees. There was no National Park Service at that time and no National Park Organic Act. So the Department of Interior, which managed, in parentheses, I could say that today too, couldn't I? The parks asked the Secretary of Interior, asked the Secretary of the Army, could you give us a hand and send troops to these areas to patrol the parks? And they were there primarily to look for fires that were ignited by campers, no different than today, or to find cattle that were trespassing or sheep that were trespassing. Now, they primarily did their work close to the wagon roads and horse trails that they had, and didn't go out into the backcountry of the park. So it was pretty much a fire management regime that just focused on human-caused fires in developed areas. In 1910, 5 years after the Forest Service was established, they had severe fires in Idaho and Montana, and known as the Big Burn. These fires caused the Forest Service to reevaluate what its purpose was, and they really saw their purpose to be to stop forest fires at all costs, and that became their credo. And the entire Forest Service was focused then for many years on fighting fires, putting them out. Because the Park Service was just established in 1916, 6 years after the Big Burn, and didn't have the expertise to do any firefighting itself, it relied on Forest Service crews and Forest Service policy for doing all of their fire management. So the Park Service was in a complete fire suppression mode as well. Known by the 1930s as the 10 a.m. policy. The 10 a.m. policy said that every fire would be put out at 10 a.m. the day after it got started. regardless. So, man, if it didn't get it that day, then it'd be 10 a.m. the next day. But that was the policy. So, you know, that meant that all the forces were focused on just whatever it took to put out that fire by 10 a.m. the next day. And again, that was the Park Service's, they followed the same policy all through the teens, 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. I got my early firefighting experience in the early 60s, I guess, and that old, as a hot shot crew member and as a smoke jumper. And I think that some of those experiences I had actually led, you know, in later years, led me to become a fire ecologist. Now, why would that be? Well, we were out there in the middle of nowhere fighting a raging forest fire that was consuming a log. Okay. So many of the fires or up in Alaska, there was a fire way out in the tundra with flame lengths at least 2 inches. And I was able to observe birds that saw this flame coming. They were on their nest. They would hop up, fire would pass, and they could hop back down. I think that experience really, again, subliminally, because I was a firefighter at that time, and I was following the 10 a.m. policy, and my credo was to put that fire out by 10 o'clock the next day. Although in Alaska, you couldn't even get to where the fire was burning by 10 o'clock. That I think those experiences just coalesced in my mind, and took a few years to actually had me actually pursue that as a career. And one of the catalysts for that was the 1963 Leopold report. Aldo Leopold actually was one of the fathers of ecology in the United States. Well, his son Starker was a professor at the University of California at Berkeley, where I got my PhD. And he was commissioned by the Park Service to do a report on how parks were managed from an ecological point of view. The impetus for that particular study, or that report, was the situation of elk in Yellowstone. And again, here's another example of how the Park Service is looking at its natural resources. Because elk were good, but they were eating aspens, and aspens were good, then elk had to be bad, so we had to do something about the elk. And the same sort of thing happened in Yosemite, where deer were good, unless they were eating willows, and then we had to do something about the deer. Well, the reaction of the Park Service was to this problem of too many elk in Yellowstone was to have the rangers go out there and actually shoot them. So what happens when the government agents shoot wildlife in national parks? Oh, the public goes crazy. And what happens what does the government do when the public goes crazy? They get a blue ribbon commission together to do a blue ribbon report. And that's what Starker was asked to do with the situation in Yellowstone. He was asked to convene a group to look at the situation of elk in Yellowstone and analyze that situation from an ecological perspective and make recommendations to the National Park Service about how they should manage elk. Well, because Starker office was right across the way from where Dr. Biswell, my major professor, had his office, I'm sure that they collaborated. And one of the recommendations that came from the Leopold report, not necessarily about elk, was that you have one hell of a problem in the Sierra Nevada because of the fire situation. The parks, they were saying, you should manage these areas as vignettes of primitive America, and part of that primitive scene was fire. And that's a big change from the policies that the Park Service was following then that were related to what the Forest Service was doing, where all fires were bad, you had to put them out by 10 a.m. So now all of a sudden we have a report that said parks should be vignettes of primitive America. The controlled use, this is in the report, the controlled use of fire is the most natural means of manipulating vegetation. And the Park Service went on 5 years later and changed their policy. So the story about the change of the policy was that the report was issued in 1963, went to the Department of Interior. The Secretary of Interior let it sit for 5 years and finally asked someone, is there something in there that we should follow? And the friend of mine who had gone to Washington at a time to look at it, said, yes, you should change your policies to better reflect what the Leopold Report has said. So the policy that came from that is that fire is recognized as one of the ecological factors contributing to the perpetuation of ecosystems. So this is 1968. So that's pretty revolutionary for a land management agency to actually say fire is part of these ecosystems, and we need these fires to perpetuate ecosystems. And again, this was for Starker looking primarily at the Sierra Nevada and the fuels that were up to here. And the policy goes on to say that fires are recognized as natural phenomena and may be allowed to run their course. So this is also revolutionary. They're not only saying that these are natural factors that should be in the ecosystem. It's okay, it's actually good to be using prescribed fires that humans set to mimic the natural fires that occurred. But there are some fires that you can go ahead and allow to run their course. Now that was just blasphemy for the Forest Service. I'll actually allow fires to run their course under prescribed conditions. There's an interesting relationship between the Park Service and the Forest Service that way. The Park Service, Steve Pine said that under a flash of enthusiasm, changes their policy and then does the experimental work to see whether it's good or not. And the Forest Service will plod away years and years and years, working experimentally to see whether something's no good, test the wind, and then go ahead and change their policy. So that dynamic, between the two is very good because one is out here, experimenting with a policy change. The other one is coming this way with experimenting and changes their policy. In 1974, the Forest Service changed their policy, somewhat similar to what the Park Service had in '68. In 1972, I got out of the Army and went to University of California, Berkeley to study specifically under Dr. Biswell. As Liz said, he was the father of fire ecology in California. His career suffered because of his enthusiasm for using fire. He was actually told he couldn't publish certain things about fire. And this is academic freedom, remember? You could do anything you want if you were a professor. Well, it wasn't that way, and they threatened his job if he kept speaking out about fire. But Doc persisted, and was always an outspoken advocate for the use of fire in ecosystems. And I was very fortunate to have him as a major professor. My first fire was a fire that we set in Yosemite Valley in 1970. You can see it's not too exciting a fire, but we could actually rest while it burned by you. But that was the first prescribed fire in Yosemite National Park. It was in the valley. And it was a good training for me because this is where I got my taste of allowing fires to burn, of setting fires rather than putting fires out. And it gives you a different perspective. In 1972, the park implemented its first managed wildfire program. This was where the policy allowed parks to have lighting fires burn, allow them to run their course under prescribed conditions. And this was this particular fire was in 1974, and certainly above 8,000 feet. This one was up at 11,300 feet, I think. And the first year we only burned 0.4 of an acre. But it was above 8,000, the first zone we had was above 8,000 feet. So, well, what's going to burn up there? That's all rock and ice. Well, my advice to any future manager would be start safely, slowly. Don't bite off 3,000 foot elevation force that have fuels up to here. Going up there at 11,300 feet and allow those fires to burn. That's the top of Cathedral Peak, if anybody knows where that Squamish Meadows off on the far right down below at 8,600 feet. Each year the zone has expanded as the park gained familiarity with it and gained confidence in allowing fires to burn. Within a few years we were already down to 4,000 feet and included some areas that had lots of fuels, but again had a prescription that certain conditions had to be met before fire was allowed to burn in those areas. So So it's done prudently. And that's also when, you know, the first people who started doing this kind of work called it let burn. Well, the Park Service did away with that term right away because that, you know, there was a sense of irresponsibility with let burn to it. Yeah, go ahead and let that burn. So it's gone through several iterations of terms. And I finally, any wildland fire that's not set by human or set purposely, which is a prescribed fire, is called a wildfire. Under a wildfire conditions, there are several management alternatives you have that range the spectrum from complete suppression to monitoring. So there's a management of the fire and there's really suppression of fire. So I've sort of arbitrarily divided those two fires into those two categories. One where we're actively suppressing it, but also those where we're taking some sort of action other than complete suppression. So in 2019, the park, might be hard to see, but you can see on the left side of the park boundary, there's a striped zone. That's that part of the park where we do immediately suppress any fire that occurs. And you also see little logs out scattered through the park where that's also the case. These are community protection zones, and there's also, what do we call it? Infrastructure protection zones and initial suppression zones. So those are management actions, but in any case where that striping occurs or the darker areas are, a fire is suppressed immediately. Because of human values primarily, and also because of the park boundary. An agency on the other side of the boundary that manages for different purposes. That area is now approximately 95% of the park. Where we allow fires to burn. But that's not just, a lightning strike occurred, we can go ahead and turn our back on it. An analysis procedure has gone through about where the fire is, what the fuels are there, what's the oncoming weather, are resources available in the zone, or nationwide to deal with that fire should it need suppression. There's a whole analysis process that you go through before you actually decide whether or not that you're going to allow that fire to occur. Have you had a fire in that zone recently? Is there another fire burning in a Denver watershed? Has that community been smoked out last year? Are there multiple fires going on that you might need to work on depending on smoke dispersion? So again, I want to make sure you understand that it's not an arbitrary, yes, let that fire go and burn. It's a process that the park goes through to analyze that fire. But that's an important point though, because before the policy changed, there was no decision. The decision was black and white. If a fire occurred, you put it out. This is much more difficult for managers because it's not black and white. It's black in that one zone along the left side of the park, but in the other areas there's a lot of gray. What you don't want to do is take out of the system a fire that has potential to do ecological good. Because that's really what the park is after, to try to have fire reinstated into the ecosystem to accrue the benefits that an ecological fire has. In 1995, the federal fire policy changed to actually recognize, and this is federal, this is all agencies now, not just the Forest Service or the Park Service, but all federal firefighting agencies changed their policy to recognize the value that fire has in these ecosystems. That, in 2001, that policy was reaffirmed. And then in 2009, the agencies finally put together implementation guidelines on how to actually accomplish that. And those guidelines specify that wildland fires may be concurrently managed for more than one objective. Before that, once you started to suppress a fire, it became automatically a suppression fire. I mean, once you made that decision, it was there was no coming back from that decision. Now, with the implementation guidelines that occurred in 2009, you can do suppression on one part of the fire, you can allow another part of the fire to burn, or you can do some fuel manipulation on another part of the fire. So it makes much more ecological sense, but it's much more difficult to deal with from a managerial point of view. I'll give you some examples of these. This is one of my favorite fires, the 2001 Hoover fire. It reburned an area that burned in 1994, which was one of our first large lightning fires that we allowed to burn. And it came to the 1991 burn and pretty much died down. So this is one of the things we're starting to see with these fires, is that there's an interaction between fires from different years. The smoke that's in the large amount of smoke that's coming out of the center is an area that had not burned previously in the last, since 1930 when we started keeping records. So I'll give you an example of how these fires interact. This is the drainage in which that particular fire, the Hoover fire, was burned. This is the Ola Creek drainage. Yosemite Valley is just to the upper left of that. At the little point there, that's the valley. So that's little wet falls that goes into the valley, and so a lot of smoke comes down the drainage into Yosemite Valley. In 1974, we had the large Star King fire. This one burned 4,000 acres. Was pretty much allowed to burn except for this little section right here, where they actually lit a backfire and burned it out to keep smoke from coming into Yosemite Valley. The superintendent was having a party at his house in the valley the night before that, and said he didn't want any smoke to come into the valley during his party. So the crews went up there, lit it off, and the resulting smoke from the burnout operation came right down into Yosemite Valley. One of the retired directors of the National Park Service, grabbed me by the lapels at that party and said, "Your Honor, were you responsible for that?" I said, "Oh, no, the managers did that. I'm just a scientist." So between 1980 and 1986, we had several more fires. And you can see the jigsaw puzzle starting to come together. When it reached the 74 fire, it went out in one spot and burned and reburned just very minor spots, completely reduced in intensity and resulting severity when it reached the older fire. Between 1987 and 1993, we're filling in more spots, but because it's a longer period of time between fires, we're still getting a little bit more of a reburn. But those reburns, again, are lower intensity and less resulting severity. What's the name of that one? Doesn't make a difference. Yes. 1994. Any of you familiar with the FAR site program that predicts how fires will spread? Okay. It was tested on this particular fire. So the way that people go about predicting how fires are going to burn using simulation techniques was tested on that particular fire, the rising fire. And then between 2001 and 2016, we're getting a lot more reburn, but we're also filling out areas that had not burned before. And then the one fire I don't have on here, the Empire Fire, which I'll show you later, burned the remaining area in here. So after over 40 years of burning, of allowing fires to burn this, we're starting to see a very definite pattern in reburns. It's just a different ecosystem altogether. The picture I showed you before with the fuels up to here, it doesn't look like that anymore. Now, Jerry, this one will rival the Jeffrey Pines that you like. This is a forest that had fuel, lots of fuel on the ground before the Star King fire and the Alaska fire and the Hoover fire. 3 fires burned through here, well actually 2, and completely opened up the surface area and opened up the canopy. Yes, we don't have as many board feet of Jeffrey Pine on that stand anymore, but we have it. And I've noticed some areas outside the park where they've not done any prescribed burning. The fire comes through, burns everything down, They replant it, you know, and 20 years later, another fire comes through and they burn everything. I'd rather have less biomass on the land that sustains itself. And incidentally, there's more carbon in those large trees than all the little trees that would have been there had we not been burned. 2013, the Rim Fire, which was the largest fire in the Sierra Nevada, burned over 250,000 acres, burned rapidly within the forest, came to the park and slowed down. Now, my Forest Service compatriots tell me, well, that's not the complete story, huh? And it's not. The land outside the park was steeper, lower elevation, had more chaparral brush in it than forest, and had greater winds associated with the fire when it was in those areas. But when it did come into the park, it did drop to the ground in those places that we had treated with prescribed fires and with fires that had been allowed to burn under prescribed conditions. And certainly in areas that we had treated with mechanical treatments around our developed areas. So, you know, to me, it's proof, you know, that the treating fuels in California is a means of reducing the intensity and resulting severity of fires, and is the most natural way to do it, as Leopold said in the Leopold report, and actually bears itself out in terms of the ecological results and benefits that occur. This is before the rim. And I won't vouch that this is in the exact same spot. But it's typical of the difference in what you get before and after. There are incense cedars in that one on the right. There's definitely incense cedars on the left. So it's the same. It's not. I didn't go up, you know, to 11,300 feet to take that picture. This is an area in the central part of the rim in the park, Aspen Valley area. This was untreated before. This is an area right across the road from that, in the Aspen Valley area, that had been treated. So the severity, the intensity went down, the severity is less. You can see that there was quite a bit of difference in the mortality that resulted from the subsequent fire. You're actually killing the trees that are competing with the larger trees, and allowing the larger trees to be sustained. 2017 fires, right close to the end here. There were 3 fires in the south end of the park and one just outside of the park. The Empire Fire, the top one, burned started on the 10th or the 13th of October, burned all the way through the end of, practically the end of November. It resulted in 7,563 acres burned. It cost approximately a little over $1 million to suppress. I said, my gosh, that's a lot of money. But when you put crews on these areas, I mean, this was monitored, some actions, some active suppression actions were taken on, some backfiring. In fact, you'll see the high severity patch right up there was the result of some burnout operations that occurred. So my point is, there is a crew on here. They're on there all the time. They're either monitoring the fire or taking some minor suppression actions or some burnout actions to manage this fire. And that could be for different reasons, to keep it from producing too much smoke over the 4th of July weekend or Labor Day weekend, or to keep it out of another drainage where there's a lot of fuels. You know, so it's not just, you know, blindly allowing it to burn. It's managing the fire for resource benefits and not impacting the public too much. The South Fork fire, the middle one here, burned, burning at the same time, the 13th of August through the 11th of October. Excuse me, 11th of November. So it was burning, you know, a fair amount of time. It was threatening a community right here. And so there were some suppression actions taken on this. In fact, I'm pretty sure one of the DC-10s was used to drop retardant on this fire to keep it from going into the community. So there was active suppression on this side of the fire this upper end of the fire was allowed to burn up into the higher temperature with no active management going on other than monitoring. So at the same time, like the policy change allowed, a single fire is being used, is being managed for different objectives. Suppression on the edge that was next to where the community was, natural resource benefits on the upper edge where it was being allowed to burn freely. This one cost $8 million, around $8 million. So what was, DC-10s are really expensive. And that, you have to weigh that versus, losing the community. You also find that, in the park and in wilderness areas, Forest Service wilderness areas, where you don't have human habitation, human structures, those sorts of things, and you have the liberty, the freedom to allow a fire to burn, then your costs are going to go down. Where you're trying to protect human values, cultural, natural, giant sequoias, natural thing you might want to protect, buildings, boundaries, those sorts of things, it's going to cost you more. So that's a luxury you have in the wilderness areas. At the same time, the redwood fire, the lowest, the one down here at the bottom, was burning also. It burned for a couple of weeks, burned 12,000 acres, and cost over $20 million. $1 million. You could almost build a wall for that. So my point here is not to contrast a fire burning on Forest Service land versus those that are burning on Park Service land, but to contrast the different management strategies and the effects that they have, and the fact that you can apply those strategies, that you have the liberty to apply those strategies differently on many conditions. One being the agency in which the fire is burning, another being the fuels and the forest types that are burning, and the other is the proximity to resources and values at risk. And the costs go up. But finally, not this past year, but well, it was this past year, 2018. We had the Indian fire, which was up on a ridge called Indian Creek, going through there. It sat there for months, burned for all of 275 acres over a 3-month period. The only management action taken on this was to burn out along the road a little bit and to monitor it. This was going on during the same time that the Ferguson fire, which was being actively suppressed outside the park and actually burned into the park, was going on. My point here is that you can have a fire such as this, or before the Empire and the South Fork fire burning, while there's a large wildfire being contained, being suppressed in the proximity. A lot of managers are unwilling to do that. So, well, it'll look bad if I'm allowing this fire to burn while people are putting this fire out outside. So it takes some gumption on the part of the line manager to actually say, I believe that these resource values are through because this fire is burning in an area where it's going to be positive, then I'm willing to stake my reputation and my career on allowing those fires to burn. Because that's what it comes down to. And a lot of managers are not willing to take that risk. It's much easier to say, put it out, and then you don't have to worry about it. But then you lose, the ecosystem loses the effect of those fires over the years. And if you look at the fuel consumption in there, that's a twice burned area. But this is, one of the things you're looking for from the ecosystem services point of view is a reduction of fuels in these areas. So that subsequent fires, as we've shown in the Illinois Basin, have burn at lower intensity with lower resulting severity. So in summary, give you an idea of how many acres have burned in the different management regimes that we have. Since 1970, when the change was implemented in the park, we've had 54,000 plus acres that have been burned with prescribed fires. Suppressed wildfires have consumed. I love it when the press says these acres were consumed. I said, no, they're still there. Fuels consumed, the acres weren't consumed. 2,000 and 3,000 acres were burned by fires that were being actively suppressed. And then our managed wildfires, where we've taken some other management actions on it, up to monitoring, some 120,000 acres. And those are the acres where we're getting positive resource benefits occur. And that. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them.
So what is the policy in the giant sequoia groves? Because they're supposed to have fires, right? I mean,
Why is it what?
in the giant sequoias in Yosemite, what are the fire policies in and around the giant sequoia groves?
Okay, the rim fire, the question was, what is the Park Service's policy for fires that burn in the giant sequoia groves? Well, giant sequoias won't grow without fire. So that gives you a first clue. So we're not going to put them out anymore. We used to put them all out. In fact, the Army in 1891 put a line around the Mariposa Grove right on the wagon road so that there wouldn't be any fires come in there at all. And that's almost doomed the grove because no fires burned there for 80 years. The policy, those are in areas that we evaluate fires that occur to see whether or not their resource benefits will accrue, and also if they might be a threat to the giant sequoias themselves. We have an active prescribed burning program in the groves. The Mariposa Grove is taking more fire than you can count. It's just a complete. You saw the Illinois Creek Basin. That's on a large scale. You put all those fires into a very small grove. That's what's going on in the Mariposa Grove. The Tuolumne Grove, which is another small grove, when the rim fire burned, was threatening to go into the Tuolumne Grove. We recognized that the fuels in there were more than what we would have preferred, and a crew went in and pre-burned the Tuolumne Grove before the rim fire burned. The result was, of course, that the rim fire dropped to the ground and burned through the Tuolumne Grove. The Merced Grove, which is our third grove, the smallest grove, has had a couple little prescribed fires in it decades ago. And it's number one on our list right now for doing a larger landscape scale prescribed burn. So the policy is really to try to get the fuels reduced through prescribed burning and allow fires to actually burn through those areas. The Mariposa Grove, they actually logged it. And I mean, they logged it. And logging trucks were pulling, white fur out of there for several days. At first they ran them out at night so no one would see them, and they said, this is silly. We're doing this, for the grove. Why should we be ashamed of it? Let's go ahead and let the logging trucks go out during the day. But it was treated, mechanically treated before the first prescribed fires burned. So there's a combination of things we go. Yes?
Did you notice a difference in mortality of large pines in the 2015 drought if it was in an area that had previously burned versus not burned?
The question was, did we notice any difference in mortality of large pines in areas that had been previously burned versus areas that had not been previously burned? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes. And a study was done actually they looked at data from Yosemite, Sequoia, and Kings Canyon National Park and looked at that. And there was a greater survivorship of large pines in those areas that had been previously burned.
And I'm thinking specifically of the drought caused beetle kill and stuff, not because of the fires, the mortality due to subsequent.
Was drought mortality different? Are you asking?
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether we have that. Enough trees to note that yet. My gut reaction would be there's less competition for those trees. There's more water availability for those trees. Those trees are going to be more robust. They're more likely to toss the bark beetles out than in an area where there's a lot of competition from understory trees. Yes?
Do you see the nearby the adjacent national forest is starting to change their fire management policy at all, or are they still logging and reclaiming?
The question was, do I notice any difference in the Forest Service in the way they're managing fires? Their policy did change. Their policy changed in 1974. So they had the liberty, if they chose to do more than they do. But you have to realize, and I'm sure you do, that the Forest Service has a responsibility of extracting timber from their lands. So, and the Park Service doesn't. So, and the Park Service is not as concerned about the loss of potential trees, potential timber trees, as the Forest Service is. So they need to be a little bit more. They need to be more careful, and that's not the right word either. More cognizant of the effects of the fire, and the effects that fire will have on the sustained yield. So I would say their approach is cautious. They're starting, in fact, I looked on the NC Web this morning and saw numerous prescribed fires being conducted on Forest Service lands, even in Indiana. So they're starting. I think they're getting the message, and I know there are a lot of good people in the Forest Service that sincerely believe in this approach to fire management, because I've dealt with them for 3 decades now. It's been a very difficult push to get that particular agency to embrace it enthusiastically. Jerry.
I'll just have to comment, though, that there's the reality that the Park Service can do things that the Forest Service can't get away with. And so, for example, when the Forest Service tries to log white fir out of the sequoia groves in the National Monument, they get busted by the enviros for doing that. So, you have a lot more trust with the Park Service than you do with.
That's not always been the case, though. I mean, there were times when the Save the Redwoods League came through and accused the park of trying to hide its dead trees.
Really?
There were along the Wamona Road. There were several. We did some early burning along the Wamona Road on both sides of the road. And the park superintendent, didn't want to just get rid of them, but they had a tree hazard of falling onto the road, so they cut the trees. Well, say the Redwoods League thought we were hiding those trees because they've been killed by the fires. And the public scrutiny of the agencies, and that public scrutiny is good. I mean, it keeps them honest. It varies depending on which agency. The Park Service gets hit on any kind of development that it goes on. Any kind of increase in commercial activities, any those sorts of things, any visitor use activities, and maybe have not a carte blanche, but a public that seems to get it when they're looking at park resources. And the park makes an active effort of explaining this. Every fire and whenever there's smoke anywhere in the park resulting from a fire that's being allowed to burn, there will be a sign along the road at the viewpoints where you can see that smoke, and it'll explain the whole rationale for it. And there'll be the other sign that says, "Do not report, please." So there's an active effort of trying to explain the program to the public, and the visitor centers are full of these things. But that's not to say the Forest Service isn't trying to do the same thing. Their critics are pretty vociferous when it comes to removing trees anywhere. Anywhere. Even though we all love wooden houses, right?
I'm not super familiar with this system, but are there places within the park that are like special habitat for wildlife, or if you were to let a fire burn, wildlife biologists would?
Okay, the question was, are there areas in the park that are special habitat for wildlife? And yes, and we burn them. Because the animals that are in there evolved with fires part of the ecosystem. Okay, so and if we're bringing fire back into that ecosystem at intensities and resulting severities that are within the natural range of variation, the critters will adjust. Now, if the fuels are greater than they would be naturally, and you burn hotter than naturally would have occurred, and you burn the whole thing down, then the critters are going to be affected. So it's the same approach. You know, we want to and I harken back to one of Biswell's credos for me was, Jan, if you're going to deal with fire, you need patience. And that's very, very true. You need those conditions that we're seeing in the Sierra Nevada have been created over, you know, a century or more. We should be patient enough in trying to restore that ecosystem in perhaps as long, and not try to do it all in one afternoon. You know, because the conditions need to be similar to what would have occurred naturally. Now, there's another complicating factor that the habitat is in the park, although it might be slightly out of adjustment. Outside the park, it's greatly out of adjustment. So the wildlife have less habitat, you know, available because much of the habitat outside the park is not suitable anymore. In fact, there was one time when the Forest Service tried to count our habitat for slaughtered owls against their tally. No, it's okay here. There's all this place in the park they can go. So there are concerns that if we're doing burning out of season, and that's one one thing, our wildlife biologists look at our prescribed burns in particular. Well, you don't want to burn when the owls are nesting, those sorts of things, and they can make adjustments to the time of burning. But we certainly would not never burn those areas.
I had a question that kind of riffs off of what you just mentioned about Yosemite being a lot more closer to the historical range variability than surrounding areas. And I've always thought of Yosemite as a place where there's sort of this trajectory of getting back closer to that since the 1970s. What do you think of as kind of the long-term trajectory, or like what's the upper bound of that? Is there a goal that it could be as close as possible to the natural range of variability? And if so, how does that kind of feed into like future range of variability with climate?
Okay, that's a pretty complex question. I'm not sure you all heard it. But the question was, in Yosemite, are we considering what is our long-term goal for this program, particularly with regard, with climate change coming in? So are we looking at just getting conditions done in a short range, or are we looking at a longer-term process? And certainly it's the longer-term process. But as climate change, the deck's being redealt, so it's hard to tell and where we're going with that. We've had a lot of fire history studies done in the park, so we know pretty well what, at least in the record that's recorded in trees, what the fire return intervals were, prehistorically, actually. In fact, some of our giant sequoia tree histories go back 3,000, tree ring histories go back 3,000 years. So we have a good idea of what it was during historic and prehistoric times and during historic times. Every one of these studies shows up through 1890, and after 1890, the lack of fire just, the same sort of thing. So we feel that if we are burning at an interval with intensities resulting from that interval, that will be okay. And that's based on just basic ecology, looking at the drivers of these ecosystems, rather than saying, okay, we need to have 10 ponderosa pines of 10 inches and 2 of 20 inches and 1 of 40 inches, and then we're going to burn until we get that kind of distribution of diameter distribution of trees. And we're going to say, no, we want a fire that's going to burn every 6 to 10 years in there, and let the fire decide whether the 10-inch tree goes or the 40-inch tree goes. And we're trying to get it as hand off about that as possible, so that in the long as an area reaches its, the one map at 95% of the park, we feel we're there. And we really do feel that we're at a point where we can allow lightning fires to burn under prescribed conditions. So we're already there.
So I was wondering if you could go back a slide and just show those acres and then mention the size of the park overall, because I think that helps provide context.
The park is 740,000 acres. So we burned close to a third of it. Now, a lot of that's not burnable. If you take the rock and ice out of it, we probably burned over half of burnable acres during that time. Through wildfires or prescribed fires. All those.
And I have a second question, and that is,
Those are cumulative acres too, so that doesn't take into account.
Oh, that's right.
reburn.
Yeah, but so some of that, subtract the reburns out of there. See? So there's, all the reburns have to be subtracted. So maybe we're not there. Wait.
And then if you've noticed if the areas affected by the rim fire versus the recent Ferguson, considering the rim was more towards the beginning of our severe drought, and then the Ferguson was following, in theory, the end of the drought. From what you've witnessed, do those areas appear different in the resultant severity?
Okay. Liz was asking about two fires. The rim fire was burned in 2013 at the beginning of the drought, and the Ferguson fire, which burned almost as many acres in 2017.
2018.
28? Rim?
Oh, no, rim was
Ferguson,
2013,
last year.
Ferguson.
Last year, this thing got wilder. Which was right, in the middle, or almost at the end, we hope, of the drought. As far as severity, there were different conditions going on during these fires, and that's probably the biggest difference. The Ferguson fire, which burned this last summer, sat there for would have sat there. It was there for a long time. There was a high pressure system over it. There was stagnant air. It wasn't moving anywhere. There were hardly any winds. So it moved very slowly, fuel driven for those acres. The rim fire, however, as I explained earlier, was wind driven through on the Forest Service section and into the park, and it was more chaparral fuels than occurred in the Ferguson fire. So the mortality was greater in the rim fire than what we saw at the beginning of the drought than the Ferguson fire, which is near the end of the drought. Not because of standing dead trees, which aren't a big contributor to fire intensity to begin with, but because of the weather conditions under which it was burning. So you remember my first few slides, you have to have that weather, that really affects the fire effects that you get. Okay, one more? Yes.
I noticed a fairly modest number of acres prescribed burns. Is prescribed burning now limited by suitable candidates or by financial authority?
The question was that we have a low number of acres prescribed burning. What was that a result of? And it's usually smoke, because this is a fire that we set. We have to set it under conditions that the local air pollution control district demands. And so the window of opportunity is very small. There's also, in the Park Service, there has not been a limited number of dollar resources for these, because there's a lot of dollars for Park Service prescribed burns that goes unspent. So it's more a restriction because of smoke. But also there's some timidity on the part of managers to burn during certain times of the year, certain holiday weekends, and so there's a little bit of timidity there on fires that we set ourselves. If, however, a lighting fire had ignited, they would feel more comfortable allowing that one to burn than one that we set ourselves, and I can understand that. So. We still have a backlog of acres that need prescribed burning. So it's not as if we're running out of places to burn. All right.
So do you have any take-home messages for kind of the West in general these days? Like, having done this for so many years in Yosemite, should everybody try to copy Yosemite? Or I feel like most of the forests are so far behind. Where do you even start?
Well, in the 12-step program, we need to recognize we have a problem first.
We got there.
And that's starting, I think, President Reagan said, why did he know we had a program to allow fires to burn, during the Yellowstone fires? So, we've come a long way, and certainly the press has been very good about, that particular message. So it's changing, and I'm not saying everybody should follow whatever Yosemite did. Other parks get tired of hearing what the white parks do. But there's a lot to be learned from what we've done. And, I recommend anybody that wants to learn about that, take a hike with me in the Illinois Creek Basin, and you can see, what 40 years of allowing fires to burn does to the landscape. Now, some foresters are going to be aghast. Oh my God, number of board feet are way down here. I could put a lot more cellulose on that land, but not in the long run. First over here, and then you get.
So, I didn't get to hear everything said. I wonder if you address or could address the role of indigenous humans in establishing the fire regime that was here before the park was established and before European settlement, vis-a-vis fire regimes that might have existed prior to the indigenous humans. And what exactly are we actually establishing now? Is it something that were those the same, or are we something establishing something?
Okay, I did cover that at the very beginning of my talk, but I can reprise the slide. Our program, their ignitions, in my opinion, supplemented the ignitions that occurred from lightning. There's more than enough lightning occurring in the park to account for the fire histories that we see in the forest generally. In areas occupied by Native Americans, there's an increase in fire. The shortening of the interval, there's more frequency increase in areas surrounding villages, in areas that they use for their husbandry. We have invited and they have participated in conducting some prescribed burns. In fact, the picture I had on the slide was of a Native American actually igniting a fire in Yosemite Valley using the techniques that they had and a drip torch. So it's definitely part of the program.
Okay. Just a quick question. Where can I sign up for doing the hike up the...
Just send me a message and and let me know when you're in the park, and I'll be happy to take you out there.
Well, thank you very much for attending.